John Milnes Baker is an award-winning architect who specializes in residential design. He was a 2018 recipient of the Albert Nelson Marquis Lifetime Achievement Award by Marquis' Who's Who in America as a leader in the field of architecture. A fine arts graduate of Middlebury College, Baker received his master's degree in architecture from Columbia University. A longtime member of the American Institute of Architects, Mr. Baker is a member of the Society of Architectural Historians and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He is the author of How to Build a House with an Architect, Harper and Row, 1988, and American House Styles, A Concise Guide, first published in 1994 by W.W. Norton, but reprinted in expanded edition in 2018. When Better Homes and Gardens magazine Home Plan Ideas featured their 10 most popular houses of all time, 3 of them were Baker's designs, including, quote, our readers' flexible all-time favorite, which they described as one of the most universally accepted houses they had ever featured. Mr. Baker continues to lecture on the history of the American house and continues to consult with residential clients as an emeritus member of the AIA.
This is the fourth and final part of my History of the American House. I'd like to welcome you all who are attending. I hope you've all seen the first 3 so that you get the full continuity of this wonderful history of ours. What we're going to cover, we're picking up from 1876 for the centennial celebration in Philadelphia, and we're going all the way through to the 1960s. The first part is going to be the Gilded Age, and we're going to look at palatial palaces, and then the colonial revival, which was going on pretty much at the same time. And then the beginning of the modern movement, which actually started back in the 19th century. And then we'll have a look at some things that happened after World War II, from 1945 through the 60s, and maybe a brief glimpse at some of the residential designs right up to the turn of this millennium, the turn of the century. So let's begin. I'd like everyone to note that every elevation in the following illustrations are copied from my book, American House Styles, A Concise Guide. And they're all developed from the same basic partie, the same plan. I state in my book that stylistic embellishments of American houses have tended to be superficial veneers that often veiled inventive floor plans and common sense designs for new American living patterns. The content, as distinct from the style, was apt to be more innovative than one might suppose at first glance. The difference between style and content, between the clothes and the person, is obviated by the use of the same basic plan throughout this guide. So let's move on. Dates of critical historical events are the equivalent of navigational buoys. Without these markers, one cannot place cultural changes in a historical content. And we're starting here with the first buoy of history was 1876. And then I won't read them all. I hope you can glance at them, and sort of ending with 9/11, which was, we all remember that. So the next slide is palatial palaces. Now, this is in 1870, America had a population of 40 million and over 75% lived in rural areas. The full impact of the Industrial Revolution was still to be felt, and the next generation would be a period of enormous change. By 1910, the population had more than doubled and almost half lived in cities and large towns. And here's a quote from between 1870 and 1900, the national wealth quadrupled, rising from 30,400 million to 126,700 million, and doubled again by 1914, reaching 254,200 million. In 1892, the Census Bureau estimated that 9% of the nation's family owned 71% of the wealth. And there's a little more I'd like to add to this. Electricity, central heating, indoor plumbing, telephone, typewriter, washing machine all became commonplace in this era, and not just for the very rich. American suburban foursquare and the bungalow soon sprouted throughout the new suburbs and small towns. Sears Roebuck and Company, Aladdin ready-cut houses, and other companies sold thousands of modest pre-cut houses and shipped them all by rail all over the country. Alan Gallons pointed out in his book, The Comfortable House, which was published in 1986, quote, thanks to partial or total prefabrication, more houses were erected than in the nation's entire previous history. And most of these modest houses incorporated the same amenities mentioned above and indeed provided a level of comfort never really known before, regardless of income. So let's take a look at this. This is the Romanesque. Richardsonian Romanesque, or even Richardsonian would be a better term for the style. It was founded by Henry Hobson Richardson. He graduated from Harvard in 1859 and became the second American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He began his practice in New York in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. And in 1872, he won the competition for Trinity Church in Boston and moved his practice there. The rectory of the church was the first house built in the Romanesque style. And it's a very massive building type. Almost, it had to be stone. There's some, I suppose, were in brick, but and you can see the defining attribute of it, or the character of it, is the rounded arch, the Romanesque arch. And you could see that very early on. He did that little gatehouse for the Ames family outside of Boston, and the huge arch, and that was characteristic of his whole character of his buildings. Here's some examples. The Glessner House is by Richardson. There's another one on the upper right, and then sort of scattered around in that whole era as you walk down in New York on the left, or Brooklyn way over on the right, or Chicago in the middle of the lower pictures. You see this rounded Romanesque arch. This is an interesting picture. This mansion is decidedly Romanesque in character, but it incorporates details associated with the Chateau-esque style as well. Remember, Romanesque was a forerunner of the Gothic. The early Norman cathedrals in England had Romanesque arches, usually in the lower levels, and the chateaus in France combined many features of the Gothic. So you'll see, it's hard to tell, they mix them together sometimes. But this is a wonderful example. Will bring us to the Chateau-esque. Now, Francis I became King of France in 1515, just 6 years after Henry VIII ascended the throne of England, and they both died in 1547. And most of the famous chateaus that were the models for our Chateau-esque style were built during Francis I's reign. Chambord, Blois, Chenonceau are perhaps the best known, but they all combined the late Gothic style with the new Italian Renaissance details just being introduced to France. Richard Morris Hunt was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he returned to the United States just before the Civil War. But not even the most extravagant of his clients were ready for so opulent and palatial a style until the late 1880s. It then became the ultimate style for the conspicuous display of wealth. Well, let me point out that the massing is irregular in the extreme. Wall dormers, round towers, pinnacle wall door with pinnacles with wall wall dormers features them. The dominant steeply pitched roof was a stylistic reference to French Gothic. The characteristic basket handle arch at the center was a late Gothic detail and a defining feature of this style. Fenestration, well, the windows are usually large double-hung units combined with French doors. Buildings were always masonry, for the most part smooth stone or stucco, but brick was also fairly common. There were always hood moles above the windows and doors. A vestige of tracery featured in the pierced railings of the balconies, decorated pinnacles, assertively fanciful chimneys combined with spires, finials, ornamental iron railings, all combined to identify the style. The horizontal string courses, pilasters, and occasional round arch were all Renaissance in origin. Too extravagant to be mannered in wood, they were always a style for the very wealthy. The top one there, of course, is Asheville. In Asheville, North Carolina, Biltmore was the home of George Washington Vanderbilt, and it was designed in 1895 by Richard Morris Hunt. And I always loved, I had a professor at Middlebury College in my history of architecture program, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Comfortable House. And he said, not the truth, but a big bankroll will make you free. And being free, you can build whatever you want. So here's another example of the Otto Kahn estate on the North Shore of Long Island. It was built a little later, between 1914 and 1919. It's a modern interpretation of the Chateau-esque style by the firm of Delano and Aldrich. Note that the massing is derived from the French prototypes, but the architect simplified the details, and the character does not look like it was transported from the Loire Valley to Long Island's Gold Coast. However, it is no less imposing. This is an example of Beaux-Arts. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris was the premier architecture school in the 19th century. America's first school of architecture was founded at MIT in 1865. It was soon followed by Cornell, Syracuse, Michigan, and Columbia, and all were patterned on the Paris type. But a year in Paris was also considered an impressive social as well as an academic credential for most American architects, even those who already held degrees. And you can see in the upper right corner is a detail from Rose Cliff, and you'll see the picture of the whole building, but it's the characteristics that show the little swags and panels and rounds, and they're all sort of applied ornament. And there's a grandiose axial formality in both the planning and the composition. Two types are generally of the roof, low-pitched or flat roofs. So the mansard roof is sometimes incorporated, but when the entrance is usually accentuated with substantial porches from the face and pushed out from the face of the facade. These buildings boast a grand scale and are built of smooth stone with tight mortar joints. Wall surfaces featuring elaborate and applied decorative scrolls, shields, garlands, swags, and statuary. An overall sense of monumental scale was meant to impress, and it usually did. This is a Vanderbilt mansion. It was by McKim-Mead and White, 1899, for Frederick and Louise Vanderbilt in Hyde Park, New York. It's on the eastern shore of the Hudson River. And that's Rose Cliff, and that's also by McKim-Mead and White in 1902 for the Ehrlichs. And it was that detail over on the right that I highlighted in that earlier slide. The next picture will be Marble House, and this was by Richard Morris Hunt in about 1890 for William K. Vanderbilt. He was the grandson of Commodore William Vanderbilt. Another one up in Newport. This is the Elms. This is by Richard Kronbauer, about 1901, for Philadelphia family. named Berwyn. Now we're looking at the Tudor. The prototype for these masonry structures are the massive country manor houses of the 16th century England. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 and was the last of the Tudor dynasty. She was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The style during the early 17th century is often called Jacobean. And during his reign, Dutch architecture influenced the architecture of English houses and is evident, as you'll see, in the Flemish or Dutch gable ends. And this was the style that was very popular back in the 20s and earlier on college campuses. You'll see it at Princeton, you'll see it at Yale and other places. It was called collegiate Gothic. And heavy masonry structures, let's look at a couple. This is a wonderful example. It's the Coe Mansion or Coe place out on Coe Estate in Oyster Bay. It was by Walker and Gillette Architects, and it was built in the 20s. This is a case where it looks almost like it was picked up and transplanted from England. And you see all the characteristic features, particularly the so-called Tudor arch or basket handle arch. And you'll see it in a couple of the other pictures as we move along. Now here's the case. This is Ventfort Hall. It was built in 1893 in the Berkshires, near and appropriately called Jacobean because of the Dutch gable ends. It was designed by Roch and Tilden for George and Sarah Morgan, and she was a daughter of J.P. Morgan. This was built in Newport in the late 1880s for James J. Van Allen. It was originally called Wakehurst. It's a copy of an Elizabethan manor by the same name by a Newport architect named Dudley Newton. But Salva Regina University purchased Wakehurst from the Van Allen family in 1972, and it's now the university's student center called Garrity Hall. Sometimes this style is called Stockbroker's Tudor, Italian Renaissance Revival. And this was the first so-called Mediterranean styles, and it was based on the palaces of the 16th and 17th century Italian Renaissance. McKim Mead and White's 1877 Villard House in New York was a harbinger of the style. Symmetrical, rectilinear, axial roofs, typically red tile with substantial cornices supported with subtle brackets or consoles. The entrances most often with a projecting portico or recessed loggia, often emphasized with a Palladian motif, which I drew on this hypothetical example. Stone or stucco, and generally the details were more, the facades were more varied than the earlier Italian Renaissance revival houses of the mid-19th century. The breakers, this is the sort of apotheosis, the extreme example designed by Richard Morris Hunt for another Vanderbilt, Mr. and Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II. Starting in about 1895 and going on in various forms, this two-story classical portico is a defining feature of this neoclassical revival. The architectural theme of Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893, it was meant to be 1892, was a celebration of Columbus's arrival, but they got started a little late. Burnham and Root were the architects chosen to coordinate the overall design, and the theme was classical. And many of the smaller pavilions set the precedent for the neoclassical revival. And they're very simple rectilinear forms. The roofs tended to be hipped in the early days, but after World War I, there were more gabled roofs, end gabled roofs. but always with the two-story monumental portico. Windows were always pretty much double hung with divided lights and little caps above the windows. And classical details and proportion were respected in the earlier examples, and less so as time went on. And coins or pilasters were always generally featured on the corners. Now the next slide is the Ogden Mills Mansion. It's in Scottsburg, New York. And again, McKinley and White transformed a smaller Greek Revival house into a 65-room mansion for Ogden and Ruth Livingston Mills in the early 1890s. And I noted at the bottom there, you'll see the mansion could just as well be called Beaux-Arts, but is more restrained in its decorative detailing and seems appropriate to me to include it with classical revival. It's a shame, really, that I took a picture of it years ago, and there was crumbling of the detail work, and so it was restored, and they painted it white for some reason. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So here's a couple more pictures on the following pages of upper left, upper right is in Ridgefield. The one on the left, lower left, is Muscoot Farm in Katona, New York, where I used to live. And I couldn't resist showing the what eventually emerged from all of this. It speaks for itself, but that still a two-story portico, but the proportions, as I said, were less respected as time went on. And that's a case in point. It's going to be an introduction from 1876 to 1929. It's from the centennial celebration to the 1929 stock market crash, because all kinds of things crashed then. And the reminiscence style period and the era of palatial palaces. But the colonial revival, which began pretty much in 1876, when America got a sense of its history and its pride, and it triggered an interest in our nation's history and a sense of our self-confidence and chauvinistic pride. No less than half of the most significant national patriotic and genealogical societies were formed between 1876 and 1896. Historical societies were formed in just about every old town. And also, this is a big change, an American way of life, more informal, healthier, and wholesome. Those were words that you find over and over again back then. It was conducive to an architecture that was subordinate to and showed deference to our regional landscape and varied terrain. We did not have to import standards of design. We had developed the clipper ship, the yacht America, the trotting wagon, and the Astor House, which was New York's first modern hotel. Mark Allen Hewitt wrote a wonderful book called The Architect in the American Country House. It was published in 1990. And I love what he said. He said, among wealthy women, the real taste makers, gardening supplanted elaborate costumes and decoration as a mark of feminine gentility and culture. So you started seeing more emphasis, as you'll see in, you began seeing more and more emphasis on smaller, unpretentious houses. There was a book published in 1929 called The Smaller American House. It was by Ethel Power, who was the editor of House Beautiful. And this is a house by Frank Forster in that magazine. It shows a very modest house, very simple plans, and more based on vernacular precedents than anything classical. So the next slide brings us to the White Pine series. The White Pine architectural monographs was started in 1914 and was absorbed by another journal, Pencil Points, in 1932. It had an enormous influence. They published the details of measured drawings of colonial and earlier buildings, but they also sponsored competitions. That's the quality of the drawing and architectural presentation back in those days. This is a fellow whose work was quite prominent. He often got first prize, and not just because of his rendering skills, but because of the lucidity and the character of his designs. Couldn't do that on a computer. This is a house in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, and the architects of these regional houses found in simple rural architectural prototypes for the 20th century. Normandy farmhouses or vernacular houses of the English Cotswolds were more at home on our shores than were Greek or Roman temples or Oriental harems. Why? Because they were of the land and were simple, direct, vernacular solutions to similar architectural problems. Okay, this is the shingle style that we're going to take a look at next. And this was flourished from about the 1880s to about 1910. And it was sort of an outgrowth to some extent of the centennial celebration in 1876, because in 1877, McKim, Mead, and Mr. White, before he actually became a partner, took a sketching trip up through New England, and they started sketching shingled and vernacular houses and barns, and they incorporated a lot of that character into some of their designs as time went on in the next decade. And the shingle style was one of those. Let's take a look. The style was not just a new set of superficial stylistic elements, but an organic style with a character that derived from an open fluid floor plan. The sculptural expression of inner volumes, given a coherent unity by the naturally weathered shingle envelope. And the term shingle style was coined by Yale professor Vincent Scully in his wonderful book, The Shingle Style. Was published in 1955. That was Fort Hill. And that picture actually I credit that picture from Scully's book. And he saw it as defining a very, very prophetic, I guess would be the best term. And anyway, these were asymmetrical buildings, varied volumes, usually expressions of the open floor plans, sometimes with bulging towers. The roof was usually a mixture of gable, and often hipped extensions. The entrance was sometimes under a complete porte cochere. You can see, I don't know how much of it you can see, but in the lower right, that was a house I spent a lot of time in as a teenager in Bellport, Long Island. And unfortunately, it was torn down, but it was built in 1885, and that had a full porte cochere that you drove through. But other than that, they often made features of the entrance as sort of welcoming under a shingled skin that really enclosed and gave unity to the whole structure. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. The upper left was south side. It was the Robert Gillette House in Newport. It was built in 1882 by McKim, Mead, and White. And it was certainly the largest of all of the shingle style houses. It was built at a time when the very wealthy were building the colossal mansions, and the Gillette family were in that same category, but chose to do a shingle style house instead. And McKim, Mead, and White also did the little house on the upper right at the Skinner House, and at the bottom there's a house by the Isaac Bell House, very, very well-known house, also by McKim, Mead, and White. In the same year, they had a busy time And then on the right, lower right, there's a little shingle style house tucked down a little dead end street. And on the lower left is a picture of Frank Lloyd Wright's first house that he built for himself in Oak Park, and that's now Greater Chicago, and it was shingle style. And a number of years ago, I was driving, let's see the next slide, I was driving through Marion, Mass, and I was going across a bridge, and I nearly drove off into the water. I spotted off to the left this gem of a little shingle style house. So I pulled over and walked around, took pictures, and it was had been untouched. It still had a hand pump at that time in the kitchen. And there was a young fellow who was sent down by his grandmother to open the house for the summer. So I was able to actually prowl around. He'd just taken panels off the window. So I waited around while he took a couple of extra off, and I took these pictures. And it absolute characterized, strictly shingle style. It's on the, I think, a national landmark, but it was remodeled and modernized. But here's Frank Lloyd Wright's house. I did that little sketch, but this is a picture taken not long ago. It was out in Chicago about 3 or 4 years ago, and I took this picture then. So the next thing, let's go to the prairie style. It wasn't long after, less than a decade after he built his own house in Oak Park, Frank Lloyd Wright developed a new and distinct regional style. And he set the tone, and there were many, many architects, some that had worked for him, some that had just known his work. And though popular in the Midwest in the early 1900s, the style offended many Eastern architects who were promoting reminiscent styles, particularly the colonial revival. And in 1918, a White Pine jury stated that the style, quote, didn't deserve all the cheap jokes passed on it by its detractors. However, they also compared the prairie houses to railroad sleeping cars and warned occupants would have no more privacy than a goldfish. When they were making some of those remarks, the house on the left was given 4th prize because they didn't want to let the architectural tree dry rot. And so they patronizingly gave that design 4th prize. And it was cribbed from this house that Frank Lloyd Wright had designed in Kansas a year or so before. And you can see the similarity, but that's all right. But the massing, long, low rectangular forms with strong emphasis. Emphasis on the horizontal, generally raised a few feet above grade. The roofs were typically shallow pitched, hipped with broad overhangs extending out from the main block of the building, covering porches and serving as porte cocheres. The entrance was usually under a broad overhang, but sometimes, as you'll see in the case of Wright's Roby House, hidden almost. You had to almost look around to find your way in. The fenestration was characteristic with broad bands of windows, usually casement with decorative leaded pane designs. Materials were vast majority of these houses were wood construction with large cantilevers to eliminate posts wherever possible. The finish was almost always stucco with decorative wood band emphasizing the horizontal. And all the trim was pretty much all square edge casing and very sort of natural and simple. So let's take a look at a famous one, 1908, was Frank Lloyd Wright's Roby House. And in the upper left, that's the lower right is taken from the corner. And you say, well, how do you get in the place? Well, if you went to the left and you went around the building and you look there, that's the main entrance. That's the front door. But you can see the broad overhangs, extreme cantilevers. And the next picture was in Chicago, and in the next picture shows a couple of houses that were in Oak Park. There's a brick one, and the upper left was the Hertley house, and then the upper right was one he did for one of the. They were the Gale brothers were early developers in Oak Park, and they hired Wright they called them as bootleg houses or as moonlighting projects, and when he was working for Louis Sullivan in the 1890s. And anyway, the lower left is a wonderful house in Racine, Wisconsin, and it's prairie style, but it's built on a very, very steep embankment. And on the lower right is an example of what an interior might look like, and that's the Coonley house. It was not far from Oak Park. It was in Riverside, which was an early suburb, and it's an extensive house. And now we come to the Craftsman. The Craftsman in America started in the late 1890s in California, largely by the Green brothers who practiced in Pasadena. And but earlier than that, take a look at the next slide, which is called the Red House. And the Red House was built in London, and it was the first arts and crafts house designed by Philip Webb, who lived from 1831 to 1915, and in 1859 for William Morris, who lived from 1834 to 1896. And this movement in the late 19th century set the tone for our American arts and crafts movement in this country, and the Craftsman was very much characteristic of the architecture. The Red House was very, very significant building. It was seen by a German visitor to Britain named Hermann Murthius, who wrote a book called The English House. It was first published in Berlin in 1904, but the reprint of it. And he described it as the first private house of the new artistic culture, the first house to be conceived and built as a unified whole inside and out, the very first example in the history of the modern house. So this is a period that the Craftsman originally originated, as I said, in California, in the Green brothers, but Gustav Stickley was largely responsible for popularizing the Craftsman movement with his magazine called The Craftsman, which began in 1901. And this was a time when the bungalow craze swept the country in the teens and 20s. And it was a natural for the Craftsman style, and prefab companies like Sears Roebuck and Aladdin Ready Cut shipped complete packages of houses anywhere that the train tracks would take them. And they included everything, literally the kitchen sink. The only thing you couldn't ship was the foundation and the septic system. But the massing basic plans tended to be simple and rectangular. So they were often two-story. The bungalow became the most popular house type during the teens and 20s. The roofs were generally gently sloped. Craftsmen were wood, but rough river stone sometimes used on the lower level. Take a look at the next slide, which is the cover of two of his publications. Gustav Stickley, Craftsman Homes, The Architecture and Furnishings of the American Arts and Crafts Movement. That's the one on the left. And though it's very hard to see, it shows an inglenook, and that was very characteristic of the houses in the period. And then there were floor plans and illustration of 78, he calls them mission style dwellings. mission in the sense that people from the arts and crafts movement were on a mission to improve the design and make people aware of what they could live in. Next slide shows, on the upper left is going to show Stickley's own house in New Jersey. And the others are just sort of at random. The house in the upper right was a house I saw in the Catskills. Lower left was a house in a bungalow, really, in Katona, New York, where I used to live. And then the lower right was a wonderful building. I don't know whether it was a service building or whatever, but in New York State's Bear Mountain State Park, and the whole theme. And then I was driving along through Millbrook, New York. Next slide, please. And there's an amazing building. Bennett Junior College was a very popular two-year college for proper young ladies back in the 50s. And it folded eventually, but apparently I've seen it, I've driven by it off and on for years, and it's just been allowed to deteriorate and deteriorate. And it's apparently it's so full of asbestos, it would cost an amazing amount of money to demolish it. So Lord knows what's going to happen. But I included it here because it is a craftsman style. And the next picture is a house that's recently been remodeled and updated. It's a Frank Foster house. It's in Norwalk, Connecticut. And that very first picture that I showed you from a magazine of small houses, Frank Foster was very, very contributor to the character of these houses, the rough stone and very simple, wonderful characters, vernacular in their character. And with that, now modern art, the period from post-World War I through the 20s and to the stock market crash in 1929, and the rise of the modern movement in the 30s, and the period through the period of the Great Depression. And there are three principal styles, if you will: modern, which from about 1920 to about 1940, the international style in the 30s, and then Frank Lloyd Wright, 1936 on. So let's have a look at the modern. The new buildings devoid of ornament with plain surfaces and the latest in plate glass windows often had the appearance of modernity, but were frequently just stripped down versions of old building types. More often than not, they were just as badly planned and inefficient as their predecessors, as the old. Modern was often a case of superficial styling. Buildings were pseudo-modern, simply dressed up in a new set of clothes. Streamlining buildings, adding bits of glass block featuring lally columns and maybe a wraparound window or two was really more style than substance, or at least most of the time. But these buildings were very boxy, rectilinear, with no distinct trim. Flat roofs were, of course, a distinguishing feature, and nothing especially different for the entrances, but large picture windows flanked by metal casements or awnings. Corner windows are also seem to feature most examples, sometimes with rounded corners. Concrete block with stucco finish was common, but buildings could be also wood frame. And here's just a couple of pictures giving you an idea of what they might look like. In fact, one is in Stony Point, Connecticut, on the shore, and the other I was driving by, it's in Hingham, Mass. So that takes care of modern, but then a much more important and lasting influence was the international style. And the international style, the term was coined in 1932 when Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson organized an exhibition of modern architecture in New York's Museum of Modern Art. Their book, The International Style, Architecture since 1922 was published as a corollary to the exhibition, and of course was enormously influential. And a lot of it had stemmed from the 20s when Le Corbusier, a Frenchman, from his Villa Savoy, built in 1929, that was featured in the MoMA, or the Museum of Modern Art exhibit. Now the massing, the structural changed in this innovative style from load-bearing walls to a skeleton frame with an exterior curtain wall of glass or insulated panels that became a barrier to the elements, but not part of the structural system. The roofs were flat, a distinguishing feature. Entrance, there's no particular standard entry. Materials tended to be light stucco. Wall characterized the style. Any and all ornament or decorative motifs were omitted from the design. And Le Corbusier incidentally captured the essence of the movement in his book, the English translation in 1927, Toward an Architecture, when he famously said a house was a machine for living in. And of course, it was all an outgrowth of the Bauhaus movement, next slide, and which started in Germany. And in the 20s, and then later on, a lot of the Bauhaus people came over here, including Walter Gropius, who became head of the School of Design at Harvard, and Mies van der Rohe went out and became head of the Illinois Institute of Technology. And this was Walter Gropius's own house. I borrowed this picture. I did not take this picture, and I'd love to give credit to whoever did take it, but I don't know who it was. And here's another picture just at random in northern part of Greenwich. I spotted that, and that's sort of characterizes the style. Then the next one that I want to get into and talk about, most influential, was Frank Lloyd Wright. And Wright was almost 70 in 1936 when he designed Falling Water. And his first so-called Usonian house was built for the Jacobs family in Madison, Wisconsin, the following year. In 1935 or 36, a wonderful thing happened. He was commissioned by Mr. Johnson of the Johnson Wax Factory to design the Johnson Wax Factory in the headquarters in Racine. At the same time, he designed Wingspread, which was a huge house for the Johnson family. And the following year, he did the first of his so-called Usonian houses. It was for the Jacobs family, and that was in Madison, Wisconsin. And it was interesting that these sparked a whole new career for Wright that flourished undiminished until his death in 1959 at the age of 92. His energy and fresh ideas assured his place in the development of modern architecture, even if these later buildings had been his very first commissions ever. And the houses that Wright designed in the 40s and 50s, which numbered no less than 150, incorporated natural materials in a way that made his houses an integral part of the site. He almost invariably used coarse stone or brick, tall French doors, or flat or shallow pitched roofs, often with a dentil fascia and extensive parapeted railings or walls of overlapping boards. He designed this house a few months actually before he died. This is Falling Water. And on the left, and I'm showing you this sequence before I show you the overall picture. You start walking down toward the house, and on the right there's a little bridge that goes across. You see people, the same person standing there on the beginning of the bridge. Halfway through the bridge, you look and you see the railing, that's part of the extension of the living room up above. And then how do you get to it? And remember how you had to find your way into the Roby house? Well, if you keep going, turn left, and that little teeny tiny glass door is the front door of Falling Water. Now, on the next page, next slide, some other pictures. The one on the upper left, of course, is probably one of the most photographed. And I visited a lot of Wright houses a long time ago. And I went out to Chicago and I bypassed Falling Water. I figured I could always get back and see that because it was a lot closer. So I only went there about 3 or 4 years ago. And that spot on the upper left, there's a viewing point, and probably that's the perfect spot to take that picture with the falling water, literally. And then other pictures of the lower left, you can't see them very well, but the interior. And I would advise anybody that ever gets a chance to go and see this. It isn't a house. It's sculptural. It's sort of a place, and he's created his own sense of space. And then that was Falling Water, but then the next, same year, pretty much, he designed this, as I said, the Jacobs House in Madison. And this is a little sketch I did of it a long time ago, and a plan. And these were the so-called Usonian houses. It was a term that he applied to these small, usually one-story houses of modest areas. Some of them were 1,500 square feet. And there's one, next slide, is an example of the Pope Lee house. It was built in the late 30s. You can see this other character, the flat roof. And let's see the next slide. It was about the same time that a development called Usonia. And this was the first one that he did for a man named Friedman, who was, I believe he was manufactured toys. And just example of how Wright's buildings complement or almost grow out of the landscape. Again, this is very near the Friedman house, and there's this slide and the next one, again, show how the buildings sort of complement or grow right out of the site. Now, in 1981, Tom Wolfe wrote a book, From Bauhaus to Our House. It wasn't very popular with architects. Some of us appreciated it. The term postmodern caught on as a name for all developments since the general exhaustion of modernism itself. It told you where you were leaving without committing you to any particular destination. There's a dichotomy between the popular house styles and the architects since the end of World War II and the new millennium. The building boomed after the Second World War. Generally, developers built small Cape Cods, ranch houses, or modest two-story cottages. There was no particular concern for style, and there were few pretentious houses. Even custom builders often use the same basic layouts, maybe a little larger all around, but still quite Spartan compared to the luxurious accommodations which have been standard for the last generation or so. The suburban Foursquare, upper left there in the picture, and the bungalow, which met the housing needs of middle America from the early 1900s to the Depression years, were abandoned in favor of basic English colonial styles or ranch houses, which evolved from Spanish prototypes. Popular designs tended to be based on American precedents. These post-war houses were minimal traditional. So what follows is a collection of the principal popular styles offered by builders and developers since the end of World War II, as well as some of that have been favored by architects. All the houses shown have the same floor plan as the other styles covered throughout this history. And but in this case, the elevations you'll see have included the garage, which you see with a little breezeway connection. So let's take a look at some of these. Now, this is the ranch and the split level. These are not really styles. They're building types and can appear in any number of costumes. But so prevalent during the 1950s and early 60s, they cannot be omitted from this discussion. Most have fixed blinds that probably could not even cover the windows, fancy porch posts or wrought iron supports, and contrasting brick veneer on the front. Minimal traditional was a compromise style of the Depression years from about 1935 to about 1950. Usually one story or 1.5 story, multi-gabled with little or no decorative details, often suggestive of the Tudor houses of the 20s with a front-facing gable and a fairly large chimney, but a much shallower roof pitch. So let's go to the next slide, where we see neo-colonial revival. It was from about 1950 and pretty much through the 1970s. Real estate developers staple their invariably pale reflections. And down below, Colonial Williamsburg opened in the early 30s, and this 1.5 story Southern Colonial has been popular ever since. With symmetrical facades and fairly steeply pitched roofs with dormers, these houses are usually either clapboard or brick. Now, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe was born in 1886 and died in 1969. He espoused the dictum that less is more and designed elegantly Spartan buildings. The Seagram building in New York was built in the late 50s, is his most famous work. Unconcerned with climate, site, and natural forces, some of his admirers designed houses using his sense of modular steel frame construction. And of course, Philip Johnson was his most devoted follower, and the famous 1949 glass house in New Canaan is the most successful example of the style. Now, brutalism popped up in the 1960s, and although Miesian houses are rare, brutalism is even rarer, though quote-unquote brutal in its rugged and frank use of exposed poured concrete, brickwork inside and out, and massive sense of scale. The name supposedly derives from British architect Peter Brutus Smithson, who was an early proponent of the style. Rarely seen in houses, the Boston City Hall by Coleman, McKinnell, and Knowles is the best example of the style. So the next pair that we'll look at is called the Builder's Contemporary, 1960 to into the 80s. Builders adopted the simplified details and massing of architects' contemporary designs. Vertical siding or clapboards with natural stains, large windows, numerous skylines were all characteristic of the style. And the roofs were usually hipped in combination with low-pitched gables. And below that, you see the builder's shed, again from about 1965 into the 1980s. The multi-directional shed roof, a vernacular form, was widely used by architects in the 1960s and soon imitated by builders across the country. Diagonal siding with brown stain and aluminum sliding windows were typical. Usually there were no projecting overhang or fascias, and the eaves and massing was often quite complex. Now, the next slide shows two more that were popular house styles. These are both sort of French-inspired houses. The mansard, as it was called, because of the mansard roof, and this sort of neo-French eclectic. And there were sort of characteristics that harken back to some of the French styles, the mansard roof, of course, and the lower one, it sort of speaks for itself. Here are two examples of architecture in the 60s, and I think this is sort of what Tom Wolfe had in mind when he talked about postmodernism. The term applies to any architect designed houses that incorporate details and features from, frankly, a checklist of trendy cliches. Stylized classical references and vernacular buildings blend in an amalgamation of, I think, affectation. Pastel colors, stripes, and eccentricity characterize the style. And super Mannerist was another exuberant postmodern style characterized by eccentric massing, whimsical fenestration, decorated with flamboyant colors and bold graphics. House numbers, for example, might be boldly featured. The facades often resembled huge advertising displays. And I said that brutalism and Messiaen were rare. I think this is even rarer, although I've actually seen a few. On the next slide, we'll see neo-shingle. It's an unfortunate term given to the first of the so-called postmodern variations. These architect designed houses derive from vernacular prototypes and often use shingles. Though sometimes crisp and unself-conscious, they were more often obtuse and perversely iconoclastic, disdaining convention in favor of mannered eccentricity. And talk about eccentricity, the deconstructionists of the 80s and 90s, a sort of postmodernism. These designs are novel, quirky, and perversely eccentric. On the level of civil liberties, I'm glad that we're permitted to express ourselves in public, but I would prefer that free speech were verbal rather than quite so permanent, even in California where the style originated. Guess what pops up again? It's neoclassical revival. About 1965 and well into the 1990s and probably over the turn of the century. Neoclassical revival would be a better term. The two-story portico is a key feature of this style. The disfigured classical orders are inept reflections of the early 19th century and turn of the century prototypes. I think it's sad to see classical orders reduce such imitations. And below that is Neo-Tudor, again from about 1965 into the new century. Tudor is usually applied to almost any front gabled house with a steeply pitched roof, prominent chimney, and fake half-timbered boards. These houses are rarely built of stone and more authentic Tudors of the 1920s. Mock Tudor or mock Beethoven would be perhaps more appropriate terms. In the 1970s, again, continuing on, Neo-Mediterranean. The term applies to almost any vaguely Spanish or Italian Renaissance house with a red tile roof, usually simulated, stuccoed walls, some round arched windows and doors, a fancy front door. Common in the former Spanish territories of California, the Southwest, and Florida, they are inappropriately built throughout the country. The bottom rendering is of a neo-Victorian, popped up about in the 1980s. A renewed interest in Queen Anne focused houses of the late 19th century had launched the usual surge of imitations. Some of the excesses of the 80s found expression in the revival of elaborate spindlework, scrolls, and brackets, and the architectural vocabulary of the late Victorian era. This slide shows two sort of extremes. The only term I really had to invent when I did my book on American house styles was what generally people call McMansions and these days, but anyway, nouveau traditional from about 1980s and the 90s. And in a sort of plea for what to do and look at today, there's also revival, if you will, or an awareness of American vernacular revival from about 1980s and into the continuing to this day. An unpretentious regional architecture can be an excellent starting point for new designs in our own era. Good planning can comfortably complement the vernacular folk architecture of the disparate parts of this country and create contemporary houses that will never seem dated. And that brings us to the end of part 4. I'd like to thank everyone who attended this series, and I hope I've helped sort out the myriad styles that have been popular throughout our history and piqued an interest in learning more and wanting to go forward looking at in greater depth. Not only is it fun, but the study of architecture also nurtures a critical sense and allows us to make informed judgments of what's being built today. So my best wishes to all. John Milnes Baker. Thank you very much.